Hello, my name is Sam, and I'm one of the co-founders and chief technical officer at Red Marmoset Studios. So I've spent most of my long weekend making videos for a dev diary, and that's kind of got me into the swing of doing it. So I feel like it might be a good idea for me to talk about some other stuff that's not just about Red Marmoset. Now, the obvious thing to talk about here, I think, is the enormous wave of layoffs that we've seen hit the games industry recently. One reason I'd like to talk about this is I've not seen many developers from inside the industry actually commenting on this very openly or honestly, although Sven Vinke at Larian comes to mind as an obvious exception there. He was the guy who headed up Baldur's Gate. And I think one of the sets of words he used that struck home with me was there is a bunch of avoidable fuck-ups. And although I don't entirely agree with his opinion, I think at least there he was spot on. Now, if I am going to be open, honest, and upfront about this myself, then where I really need to start is with the fact that I made some avoidable fuck-ups, our company made some avoidable fuck-ups, and in fact, some of our partners did as well. And this led to us making people redundant at Christmas last year. Now, that being said, I think there's broadly two different types of redundancy that I've experienced, and the one that I inflicted on other people is one that I've experienced myself before. So what happened with our company was pretty straightforward, really. It was that invoices weren't being paid on time to us, and in some cases, they weren't even being paid at all. We very quickly found ourselves in the position where paying our own employees was dependent on us getting money in and getting it in on time. And rather than allowing that situation to continue, we decided that we should be honest with ourselves as well as our employees and make them redundant instead of trying to drag things out and keep them going in some kind of bullshit situation that was based on hopes and dreams. Now, that being said, and especially as someone who was made redundant around Christmas myself, quite famously at one point, we really tried our best to go above and beyond for our employees. We gave them all a bunch of money that they had absolutely zero entitlement to because, well, you need money to live, and when you lose your job, you need time to find a new one. Although we couldn't exactly afford to give them piles of money because, well, like I said, we were relying on people paying us on time to be able to pay them. So we did our best and gave them everything that we could. Other than not being paid on time or paid at all, we did make some other mistakes. We overcommitted ourselves. And in fact, when we made the redundancy payouts, we kind of screwed ourselves over because we were lumbered with an office that we had to continue paying for several months. An office where, in consultation with our partners, we decided to go for a 12-month rather than a 6-month contract in order to save money. And I'll talk a little bit more about bad decision-making like that in a bit. Now, another one of our big fuck-ups was on me because I took my eye off the ball. Instead of buying standard hardware, we ended up buying our employees their choice of computers, which resulted in a lot of machines with flashing lights, water cooling, and more monitors than are necessary to be productive. This left us with less money to cover the office rent payments or the redundancy payouts. I then managed to fuck up again. I had this idea that instead of holding our hands out to publishers and asking them to please give us the money to make our game, that maybe we could farm out programmers and possibly other developers to fulfill third-party contracts and become a kind of work-for-hire studio in order to bridge the gap. And in fact, this worked out for us quite well at first. So my naivety then got compounded upon by ambitious funding plans, where it was assumed that I was going to be able to bring this business model into fruition, because in the climate at the time, it looked like that would be possible. I kind of want to make it clear that I didn't really push anyone towards this or sell it very heavily. It just seemed like such a good idea that people bought into it immediately, and they thought it was going to work too. In fact, the first hire we made with this in mind did actually work out. We managed to have him work on Bad Blood for about a month, and then we managed to farm him out for quite a bit more money than he cost, which in theory should have enabled us to build up some money, except that it just kind of got sucked up by our running costs. So this was in the first quarter of 2023, probably 6 to 9 months after I'd actually seen the first warning signs of what was going to come. it suddenly became a lot harder to find these kind of work for hire contracts. Some of the studios that I'd worked with in the past had started downsizing, either by just not replacing people when they left, or actually making layoffs. Some of the bigger groups that people were relying on for funding started to refuse new work. They started to pull out of their existing operations. And to be honest, it started to look like this idea I had of making a viable business without relying on other people's money was starting to fall apart. For a while there, and I don't think I was alone in this, but we all sort of hoped that this was just some kind of blip, that there's always rounds of redundancies and this kind of fluctuation in the games industry. And I'll get around to talking about why that is in a moment too. But of course, it became clear eventually that this just wasn't the case. And well, I've told you the rest of the story at this point already. So now that I've talked about our fuck-ups that were avoidable, I'd like to talk about a much more common class of fuck-up, which seems to be part of the industry standard way of working. And in fact, this describes the vast majority of redundancies that I've actually had inflicted on myself, or that I've seen other people suffer. So the problem is that when hiring game developers, whether it's programmers, artists, or designers, although it does seem to be slightly less the case with programmers than the others, you'll typically try and employ people on a permanent contract, or at least this is the idea. But the reality is that these contracts are tied to projects. So this is what happened to me at Codemasters, for instance, where they hired me on a permanent contract, but the reality was that there was no job security with that contract, except for the job security that would come if we managed to finish the game on schedule and it made more money than could ever be hoped. And this should have been foreseeable. In fact, they made a lot of screw-ups there, because this project that I was on, they'd already burned a fuck ton of money on an even more ambitious project which never saw the light of day. So my job security wasn't just tied to this one project, but also the existing failure of another project. Now, the douche nozzles who were working at Codemasters at the time who are responsible for this are not particularly unique in behaving this way. This happens all across the industry, and it's quite easy to solve in my mind. So I've also done work that ended up being used in movies and TV, and they have a really different approach to this, and it makes a lot of sense. It makes exactly as much sense in games, to be honest. And this is that when you sign up to work on a movie, you typically don't get a permanent role, unless you're working in some production office that has multiple projects on the go. That's quite different. But if you're signed up to work for a film, you'll have a contract that lasts for its production schedule. If you sign up for a TV series, you might be signed up for the series for its expected run, or perhaps for 1, 2, or 3 seasons, or in some cases, even a single episode, or a handful of them. Now, as far as I can tell, the reason that the games industry doesn't work this way is basically that they're unethical cheapskates and they've been able to get away with it for a very long time. It's sort of become normalized that it's okay to screw a bunch of people over at the end of a project, even if it's successful. So, as far as I can see, the popular reason for these dishonest permanent contracts that have no job security at all is that they're cheaper. And this makes some sense. Short-term contracts are more expensive month per month. And that's because the person who's working them doesn't really care entirely just about the monthly salary. What they're also looking for is some money to tide them over in between work. Or at least they'll do this if they're honest. I have to admit, I've met people out there who will work 2 or 3 contracts at once, not just overlapping them at the ends, but as a way of working in order to make a fuck ton of money. And there's actually reasons they can get away with this, as distasteful as it is, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Now, I've always found this a little bit distasteful. I don't think I'm alone in this, because it feels like some kind of theft. When you give someone a permanent contract, the idea is job security. That's why you're getting the person for cheaper, in part. There's also maybe company benefits, but those are usually a tax write-off, so they're not quite as expensive as you might imagine, at least for the people paying for them. And, well, it kind of feels like theft to me if you know full well that you're going to let people go at the end of a project. giving them a permanent contract where you're just going to steal that job security away from them, and you're planning to do it up front. It might not be direct theft. You're not taking money out of someone's pocket or stealing their possessions out of their home, but what you are doing is stealing their future. Now, I don't think this is the whole picture, and there's another problem I've seen in the games industry from my first job through to my last, and this is the ever-decreasing quality of game developers as a whole. Now, it's not that individuals are getting worse over time, it's that the quality of new applicants is decreasing, and the number of jobs that they need filling is increasing. I've met a whole bunch of programmers in my time, and I'm going to apologize if they recognize themselves listening to this whilst I talk about this one, because the quality bar on what they're able to achieve has become staggeringly low. Meeting a programmer who lacks the geometric skills to find a straight line between 2 points is increasingly common. Most of them that I've run into, at least these days, don't know how to solve any equations at all, including the ones you were taught to solve at middle school. I think some of this speaks to the ever-decreasing quality that we see in AAA games, and even not AAA games, but in indie games as well, or smaller games. Now, I'll use some concrete examples. So, I'm a massive fan of Kerbal Space Program, but watching the development of Kerbal Space Program 2 from the sidelines has been embarrassing. They seem to have produced, at least on the code side, about as much work as I would expect from one programmer working over the time span. And I'm not talking about a hero-level guy. I'm not talking about John Blow or John Carmack or anyone who has some chops. I'm talking about what my expectation is for a mid-level programmer. To pick on another example that we've seen recently, that god-awful Suicide Squad game. And this came from the people who made the Arkham series. And the reason why this is so jarring is that the game is uglier and it plays worse. I know there's been some fuss about the political message and the use of online services, but I don't think that really factors into the fact that they managed to make something uglier than what they were able to make 5 years ago that feels like dog shit by comparison. And when I say the feel, I mean how the characters move, how things respond to buttons, how the world itself feels, the atmosphere that's painted, all of these things, they just somehow managed to fuck them all up. In fact, we've seen so many of these kinds of failures recently that I think I could probably talk for about an hour just about games that are shit, that have no excuse for being shit. And the harsh reality is that this factors into layoffs. Aside from the fact that some of these people should probably have never entered our industry, they're just here because they want to be here. They went and got a certificate, did some qualifications at college and university, and then they forgot almost everything they learned after they'd done their exams, because that's how the modern education system works. And then they go and try and get a job using those credentials. And, well, the industry, and not just our industry in general has always been quite soft on this. We don't like to get rid of people. It can be quite difficult to fire them until they've fucked up massively again and again. And aside from these people being a waste of money to begin with, there's also the unfortunate reality that if you start producing shit, people aren't going to buy it. They're not going to enjoy it. They're not going to buy the next game quite so eagerly. And the people who then suffer are exactly the people who we see getting laid off. It's not to say that they themselves are shit, although a good chunk of them probably don't deserve to be there. There's another chunk of them who do, and they're just kind of caught up in this. Just because the studio produced a steaming turd doesn't mean that those individuals aren't capable of doing really good work. And pouring some salt onto the wound is the fact that a lot of companies are still posting record profits. The games industry seems to be growing somehow, despite all of this. We also get to see some vile people do what an old friend of mine described as fail upwards. They reach the top and they absolutely fuck up. But what they're able to do is then bounce over to another job that pays insanely well and is on that same level. And then they fuck that up. But because it takes so long for this to, this cycle to repeat, they're able to make quite a tremendous amount of money despite being absolutely fucking useless and causing a great deal of harm in their wake. And to be honest, I want to talk about something else briefly here, which is that as I've gone up through the ranks, as I've been exposed more and more to what happens at the top, I've been more and more mind blown by some of the attitudes I've found, whether it's relying on future investment money to pay people's salaries, or the idea that people are expendable, they can be treated like they're your minions or your monkeys, and those are words I've heard people actually use. And that's before we even get into all of the deals that are hinging on some kind of future promises or just some straight up blagging. Now, I have a really harsh analogy for the criticism that I gave earlier about the general business model that I see in the industry. And the analogy I use is a homeless crack addict who wants to get tick off of his dealer. Now, I think this analogy works because what's happening is that someone who has nothing but is desperate for something, and let's be honest, it's the wrong thing that they're desperate for. They should probably be using that money to try and build a business instead of trying to get their one-shot big fix. They go to someone who has absolutely no ethics and scruples but has the resource that they need. And so they'll trade off the fact that they'll have to pay even more for it in the future for the fact that they can't afford it today. And that's a pretty despicable situation. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that every publisher or investor type falls into this category, but there's certainly a lot of them that do. In fact, most of the people that we've had the good fortune of talking to, including the ones who have rejected us for the most part, well, the reason that they do reject us is because they don't want to set us up to fail. They don't want to make us beholden to them when there's no good reason for that. And they don't want to put us on the line for a load of money that we're going to end up owing them later. I think I'm quite fortunate, and maybe this is an arrogant thing to say, but I'm quite fond of my ethics, and I really enjoy when someone big and powerful comes up to me thinking that I'm going to go along with whatever the fuck they want. I really enjoy telling them to go fuck themselves. I really like telling them that they're a despicable person and that they should rethink their life, that they should probably get the hell out of our industry, and perhaps even get the hell off of our planet. But unfortunately, most people I've met who are involved in this, they're not like that. They try and be polite, professional, and nice, even when they're dealing with the literal devil. They might even be grateful for what they see as a fantastic opportunity, because somehow they're able to look past the absolute evil that they're about to get into bed with. And that's another element here that doesn't help, is that a lot of people end up in these situations that they really should have been avoided just by saying no. They'll end up making money, turning a profit, filling their bank accounts, and yet having to make a load of people redundant anyway because someone a couple of levels up the hierarchy from them has told them to do that. And the reality is they put themselves 2 levels below those people in the hierarchy. They had to make some choices to get there. And like I say, I'm really grateful for the kind of bad attitude and bollocks that I have, where I can just tell these people to fuck right off. I think at this point I've covered everything that I wanted to, and I've definitely set myself up for one hell of a video editing task today. Hopefully I can get this bitch out the door, and you can all enjoy it. At the very least, I've got a ton of shit off my chest, and I think I've put out a well-informed opinion there, which is backed by experiences. It doesn't necessarily paint me in a great light, having been responsible for some of these layoffs, but at least I can say that I've done my best to be open and honest about the reasons why this happened, and to try and address the issues that I see plaguing the games industry as a whole today. So, on that note, thank you for listening. I'm going to go and smoke a cigarette and enjoy some kind of alcohol.